Good morning, BSN. My name is Paul Adeyinka, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday's Zoomina. Today's topic is organizational culture. What's really going on beneath the surface? The topic explores parts of responsible leadership. And for these discussions, we are joined with two great, wonderful people who are part of the BSN family, Dr. Ajit Menon, our speaker for today, and Dr. George Woods, who will be reflecting. A brief introduction. Dr. Ajit Menon is a strategic advisor, organizational psychologist, and co-founder of Inside Edge Advisory, specializing in leadership, culture, and transformation. He works with boards and executive teams to navigate complex change, align leadership, and drive sustainable organizational performance. Dr. Menon previously served as Chief People Officer at Investec, advising the CEO and board on large-scale cultural and business transformation. His expertise spans executive coaching, organizational development, and behavioral dynamics in high-performing environments. He is also an academic and thought leader, teaching leadership and change at leading institutions and co-authoring work on how organizations truly function. Dr. Ajit, you're welcome. Dr. George Woods, who is a reflector, is the CEO of the Culture Architect, a system thinking C-suites, executive, and organizational transformation strategist with over 30 years of cross-sector leadership across financial services, healthcare, and social enterprise and humanitarian organization. He has led major strategic, cultural, and operational change initiative for global institutions, including HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Nedbank, and St. John's Ambulance. His work focuses on building high-performing cultures, enabling organizational resilience, and driving sustainable growth. Dr. Woods also lectures on leadership and strategy and serves as an academic tutor at BSN at Business School Netherlands. He actively contributes to social impact through board service and leadership mentoring across UK and Africa. Dr. Ajit, you'll be having 15 minutes for your session, while Dr. George Woods will have 5 minutes, and there will be a Q&A after the reflection. So everyone to please drop your question in the Q&A box. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Menon.
Excellent. Can you just let me know if you can see the screen appropriately?
Fantastic.
Yes. Great. I can see thumbs up from George. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about organization culture and how I see it in terms of what's really going on beneath the surface. And that's how I've entitled today. What I will go through is a little bit of one of the definitions of culture that I find most useful in terms of thinking about culture. Then understanding a little bit about how do we actually research culture in organizations? How do you actually get to what is in the bottom of the surface there? I'll give you a case example from a piece of work that I did with a global specialist insurer. And if we have time, perhaps some of the lessons that I have learned in doing this over the years, which might be helpful for those of you who are also looking to do this kind of work. I love this cartoon that I saw in terms of thinking about culture. A lot of times in organizations, things happen. People do various different things, not necessarily always knowing why they do it or how it started, because so much of this is a part of how we do things around here. And so I found this was quite an apt way to start the conversation today. In terms of thinking about a definition for culture, now this is a very wordy definition and I know that, but I'll break it down for you. Edgar Schein was one of the thought leaders in this space, came out of MIT, did a lot of work as a social psychologist. And it's a very wordy definition. He talks about it as a pattern of shared basic assumptions, which essentially are norms, it's unwritten rules that a group learns as it solves its problems, and has two problems he talks about. External adaptation, which is how the organization or group adapts to the external environment, context, what's going on. So whether we have a financial crisis or we have an earthquake, it's how the group adapts to the external context. And internal integration. Internal integration is how the group comes together internally. So when you think about how it's structured, how the silos come together, what are the practices that's there. And these two ways of problem solving help the organization enough, and therefore they get taught to new members who join the organization as the correct way to act, think, and perceive. So if you think about it, culture is really a way in which groups or organizations solve problems. Culture is far more strategic. So that old thing that people used to say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, actually I kind of debunk that to say culture is strategy. It is the way in which we work, because that's what helps us think about how we solve our problems of survival and existence as a group or organization, which is what makes us so powerful. So why talk about this? And when I talk about below the surface, why talk about this? Is I like to use a metaphor of the organizational iceberg. I'm sure many of you have heard this before, but it's good to remind ourselves again, is that a large part of what we talk about culture is what sits beneath the surface. Now, when you think of the famous Titanic that sank, we all know what happened there. But the interesting thing was, it wasn't that part of the iceberg that they saw that sank the Titanic. It's the part of the iceberg that they didn't see. So even in this picture, what you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. What's beneath the surface is far more, there's a lot more. I think there's something like a statistic of 80% of an iceberg sits below water. And what's also really interesting is that in that 80% that sits below the water, is the most dynamic part of the iceberg. It's where there are ice algae, it's where there's life forms, it's where it's constantly changing because of friction with the water. So it's really dynamic, and a lot is going on below that surface. So if you look at the organization as an iceberg, what is formal is above the surface, what you can see. As you can see there, it's what is overt, what's logical, what's rational. So it's things like our mission, our objectives, our structures, our systems, our policies, procedures, products, strategies, etc. It's what's rational. It's what's above the surface, what we can see. But what is informal in that big part of the iceberg that sits below, that you can't really see, that's covert, that's irrational, that's unpredictable and hidden, are things like your perceptions, our attitudes, the emotions that we have, our conflicts, power agendas, who likes whom, who doesn't like whom, all of these things that happen in groups. It sits below the iceberg. And that's what really makes up a large part of culture, because it determines how we act and how we behave. Values are a very interesting thing. For me, values sit just on the surface, because very often in organizations, you'll see values put on mouse mats or on mugs or on screensavers. But they'll only live there if we don't actually behave and act rather than just say what they are. So really, when you think about culture, it's a really big part of the organization that you don't see, but that is kind of an engine that really impacts how we act, how we feel, and how we behave. And why is that important? Because that's what helps us with how we adapt to the external environment and how we pull together internally in order to solve the problems of the organization. So actually, I was thinking about this quite a lot, and it's very similar to, if those of you are familiar with the model of personality for individuals as well. If you kind of put both those models together as a metaphor, when Freud talks about conscious and unconscious, what is conscious is, in organizational culture, are artifacts, what we can see, the building, the structure, the strategy. What is in that pre-conscious, just out of awareness, really, is just on the waterline. That's why I say values sit there, because sometimes they can be conscious because we list them, but a big part of it is how we act and behave. And then what's really unconscious in terms of what is out of awareness for us but drives our behavior. In Shine's idea of culture, it's those basic assumptions, those norms, those ways of behavior that tells us this is what happens in this organization. So that's how I wanted to set it up for you before I kind of move into thinking about the case and the story that was there. Really want to set up this idea of culture being a driving force for strategy, culture being strategy itself, really looking at how we act and behave and what that means and why this is so important for us to look at. Because so much of it is hidden, but so much of it impacts how organizations survive, how organizations thrive. So the case study I want to tell you about is a multinational insurance company that I worked with. They're a global specialty insurer, and this piece of work was done just before COVID. So again, think about it, external adaptation, the environment was changing, right? And what did that mean for the organization in terms of what it had to think about? A little bit of context. The business was headquartered in London, but it was a Japanese acquisition. So even though it was headquartered here, it was acquired by a Japanese firm. So the mothership was in Japan. They had 650 people worldwide, so not massive. And what happened was that they had noticed in 2019 that they needed to do something about changing behaviors in the organization in terms of how some of the people were acting and behaving, especially in terms of the underwriters in the business. And what this really meant for them, because they found that it was really impacting their ability to do well in the London markets. So what they came to us first was and said, can you help us to change our policy? If you change our policy, it will change the rules of behavior. Therefore, it will change the culture. And we said no, because we said to them that that's an above the surface change, but just changing policy, you're not going to really impact culture in terms of how people behave. And we said, so they went somewhere else. They got somebody else to change their policies. Nothing happened, nothing really changed because after all, it became just something written on a piece of paper. So they came back to us in 2020 and said, all right, can you come and really help us think about what's happening in the culture of our organization, something we can't see because we feel that's driving a certain kind of behavior that's not helping us survive in this market that's happening. So what did we do? We did an analysis of what it looked like in terms of what it felt for them. So we did a bit of quantitative analysis that informed our search. We did semi-structured interviews, but these interviews were done in a way in which we asked narrative stories. It was really about getting to the heart of what was making people act and behave. So they were done in in a way in which we basically got a lot of stories about what people were doing, what it felt like to work there, what was their experience of working in this organization. And we did some focus groups, which was a number of people across the business. We ran groups with them where, again, we gleaned through gleaning stories from them. We got a lot of understanding of what were people saying about what was the experience of the organization. So look, there's a very interesting thing to think about. There is the told story, what we say, but then there is the lived story. When you're in an organization, you can understand what is the lived experience. And it was about that. So this is the way we constructed it. We spoke to people from across divisions. We spoke to about 10% of the organization. And we got a lot of information from previous surveys as well. So, okay, we got all this data and all this information. So what did we find? Here are some actual quotes from what people were saying. And it's very interesting when you ask people, what's it like to work here? Another question I like to ask is, if you had to meet your friend in the pub and they said to you, you work in this organization, what would you say to them? And it was very interesting because what happens is it gets people's defenses down and they tell you the true story, the lived story, not the told story. So when you read some of these, you can see tripwires are everywhere in the company. It's an environment where it's impossible to succeed. Front office is a 4, back office is a 2. Empowerment is good. So, very different kinds of ways in which people were telling the story. Now, the work in culture work is you don't go on face value of what's being said. You have to triangulate your data to be able to really read what's happening between the lines and below the surface. And I'm going to give you a very quick glance of what we kind of started looking at in terms of what did we find. These are the 4 things in terms of their values above the surface: empowerment, innovation, collaboration, and we are in this together. That's what they say about it. But what was really going on in the culture? What were some of those norms, those basic assumptions? What was really being said was what were these things below the surface? Don't make mistakes. You cannot fail, and you cannot even fail safely in this organization. Because if you that's why it says that tripwires everywhere. It's very difficult for them to, anything that happened, they would get killed off very quickly. There's a quote here says, I don't know what happened to them. They could still be locked up in the cupboard. Sounds like a really dangerous place to work, isn't it? So this idea of don't make mistakes was very important. So they talk a lot about collaboration, their values, but the real story, the real lived experience is what is important is your team and no one else. So there was no cross collaboration, no people working across their silos. There's another thing here that says you are safe in your team, but not outside of it. So the idea of where you feel safe, stay in your lane, it was quite interesting. There's a thing about, they talk a lot about empowerment, but the real story was the underwriter was the king. Nobody else was empowered to do anything else because the underwriter held all the power. There's a whole idea about innovation. They spoke about innovation, go and do things. But again, because of the feeling of unsafe danger, the story really was ask for permission for everything. Risk, risk, risk. And so you can see how the lived experience of the culture was very opposite to what they were saying were their values. And this was something that was really impacting how they were able to work because they were giving a message of empowerment, innovation, collaboration. But when you were in the organization, in the waters, what was really possible felt very, very different. And that's what we had to work with because that's what was really holding them back. So what did we do? And these arrows go everywhere for a reason, because that's how action research works. It's an iterative process where everything that you do impacts either the previous or the next stage. And most importantly, the really thing about action research is you're doing it in order to change the organization. So, we kind of did a whole lot of things across the organization, helping them co-create what the way forward would look like, really identifying what were the lived values versus the values that were on the walls and the mouse mats and the mugs, helping them to really put themselves in the different roles and see what does it mean for us to break down the silos, to truly innovate, helping them to envision what would a future look like, and therefore what were some of the non-negotiable behaviors. That is really important. What are the non-negotiables in the culture that will not denigrate who we really are? And that was a piece of work that we did. And what was really interesting was that after the 18 months of this piece of work, some people left, those who could not deal with it, and that happens in culture work. But the organization found an uptick of those who did stay. The level of satisfaction, the level of performance was in a completely different space. So much so that even from a regulatory point of view, they were doing really well. And they realized that it wasn't necessarily a policy change, but a real impact in culture that moved them forward. And actually, I was speaking to the CEO post-COVID, and he said to us that it was the work we did just before COVID that helped them really come together in terms of internal integration to hold them through what was a really difficult period going forward. So I can see I have a minute and a half left. So what have I really learned in doing this work? I've been doing this now for about 25 years. That's one example and one story, but this has happened in multiple different places. Organizations don't always know what they need, but they do know what they want. They come to you and say, this is what I want. But it's really important as consultants or even leaders working in this space is to truly get to what is the root cause of the problem. Go beneath the surface, truly to understand what is there. Symptoms, not root causes is what they say. That's why you need to ask the question. You have to look at the symptoms, but go straight to the root causes after that to ask the why question. Why do you think this is important? Changing culture takes time. You can't do it overnight. It takes a lot of time to be able to work and help people to be able to envision a future and then work from there. This work is not easy, and organizations must be prepared to be part of the change. Because if they're not prepared to be part of the change, it's not easy for us to be able to actually implement it. So that's the kind of presentation I wanted to give, a little bit of flavor of how do I look at culture, but most importantly, what do we do with this and why is it really important? Thank you very much. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Ajit. And as always, a really engaging topic. And thank you for presenting it in the way that you have. And I think you'll see from the attendees' appreciation of thumbs up and applause, a really meaty topic. And I mean, the concept of what lies beneath and then that visible surface and how cultures are formed and sustained. And I think what you did for us today is you took us through a process of what thrives, what organizations thrive and which simply survive. And I think that was really, really helpful. So would it be fair to say that the central argument is this, that organizational culture is not what is written on the wall, it is what happens in the room when no one thinks they're being watched? And I think you brought that to life for us. I think the other thing you brought to life for us is the gap between espoused values versus enacted behavior. The way the place feels. We did a discussion some weeks ago, and it was almost the smell of the place. Okay. Not necessarily the visual appeal of the place, but actually the smell of the place, that sort of tangible experience. And I think you drew some of that out in your commentary as well. Thank you also for bringing in Shine. I think Shine still holds true for us in many respects, and so as an academic framework that holds. The other thing you did is you brought into reality for us the use of action learning, and Business School Netherlands is based very much on the principles of action learning and problem solving together. The other thing you did is you brought to life external adaptation. So how organizations appear externally, what that internal resilience looks like. And what we've done in times gone by is we've spoken about brand coherence and culture. And so how customers experience your brand versus how staff deliver according to that brand, or stakeholders deliver according to that brand, and whether there's coherence or it's not coherent. And your customers will very quickly experience if what you say on the wall in terms of your values and how you operate is not actually how you operate or how you display externally. And so you drew out some of those dynamics for us around internal resilience and external resilience as well. You've also given us some opportunities for practical application, and thank you for that. And frameworks of how you assess. What we've also done in times gone by is we've looked at the idea that you can actually diagnose culture, organizational culture, and you can remediate organizational culture. But I think what you did for us today is you also said, but actually, do organizations know what they need? They know what they want, but do they understand what they need? And I think you brought that to life as well. And so I think, folk, just to say, Dr. Ajit Menon wrote a really, really good book. I believe it was entitled "What Lies Beneath," and we're hoping to, at some point through the business school, feature you in books that are read, and we'll use that as an exploratory case study as well. And what you do in that book is you explore several case studies as both the implementer, the reflector of what worked, what didn't work. So really, really helpful. So thank you. Excellent presentation as always, Ajit, and good to have you with us. So Paul, I think it's over to you because we'd like to leave maximum time for questions.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ajit and Dr. Woods. It's been an amazing presentation. And from the responses, we're getting a lot of comments online, people responding to the presentation, right? A lot of wonderful comments. Okay, and we have quite a people from global audience, yeah, from Calgary, from Nigeria, from Namibia, from the Netherlands, from Kenya, from Zambia. I mean, it's very diverse audience. So Dr. Ajit, you speaking to a global audience. And all right, for those who have questions, please can you drop your questions? Okay, we have 3 questions already in the Q&A box. Good. From Tony Dende, it says, how do you deal with cancerous culture organizations where employees are so afraid to provide honest feedback when you ask questions as a consultant? Some even get sucked into the toxicity in the workplace that leaders claim they want to fix? That's a very good question.
I think that's an excellent question. And you know what? The thing is, very often with something like this, it is leaders, leaders, leaders. So, you have to look at leadership. And if you're asking me that question as a consultant, It's a shame I'm not able to interact with you and ask you what's behind your question, which is what I would do. Because if you ask me the question as a consultant, it's helpful to think about where has a request come from? Who is asking you to change the culture in the first place? If it's come from leadership, then a lot of it is about reflecting to leadership how difficult it is for people to be able to have an honest conversation. It's not enough to say we need honesty if you don't create the conditions where people are able to be honest. So, like in the example I gave you, where they speak about innovation, if they say we want you to innovate, but actually the feeling is I can't really innovate because if I make a mistake, I will be in trouble. How can you really innovate? So, in a situation like that, usually it's about asking leaders what do they truly desire, what do they really want to make happen, and reflecting to them that the environment that they are creating is one that's causing the toxicity in the first place. It's a very dangerous and difficult thing to do because you need to have leaders in the right place who want to listen to it. So I think my thing to you would be exactly that, is that they need to be ready to be able to listen to where the truth is from, and how do you therefore speak to that truth and reality?
Indeed. May I add something to that,
Please.
Ajit? And I suppose one of the aspects we've addressed in the past as well is around macro and micro cultures. So the macro culture of the organization versus how the micro culture is experienced. And what we have said to leaders is think about how you lead. The rest of the organization may not be how you would want it to be led, but there is certainly an opportunity for how you lead and so how you influence your own microculture. Notwithstanding, you want to be able to change the whole system. The other thing I think we would advocate is certainly for leaders to do the shadow work.
Mm, mm.
You know? And so a part of what you do is you play back, you mirror for them what's happening in their organizations, and that's not always comfortable.
Yeah.
And then have the negotiated conversation around what is your role as a leader and what does this mean for some internal shadow work that you need to do. So it's a lovely space to work in. And when you're able to drive true lasting cultural change, it really is quite rewarding. Yeah. Paul, I see there's two other questions. So are you happy for us just to address?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just looking at the Q. I didn't find the Q&A tab. Yes, absolutely. How should we go through this? What's the best way of doing it?
So so the next one says, in change management issues, where the top officers are the hindrance to effective change management, what would you have suggested in such an environment? And I think you partially answered it, but if you've got some other insights you'd like to share.
I think it's pretty much a similar kind of question, is that, it's about if the top management is the hindrance, what are they looking to achieve? You can't really work with changing an organization if your leaders aren't there with you on that as well.
Yes.
So I think it's pretty much similar to the previous question, which is about reflecting back to leaders. What is the role that they're playing in hindering the change in the first place? Otherwise it's not going to happen. I think
Indeed. I think it's
hiding
right.
to nothing, as they say. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Then there's a question from Anis, and she says, in my dissertation, one of the key findings suggests that HR instruments have the capacity to influence and reshape organizational culture. I would be curious to hear your perspective on this finding. Do you agree with this conclusion? And what are your thoughts on the role HR instruments play in cultural change within organizations? And I suppose, Ajit, that's sort of part of the diagnostics piece. And then there's partly the interventions, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, look, this might be slightly unpopular view. I was a chief people officer myself, and I don't believe that the responsibility of culture lies with HR. I say this to you, and again, this is as I say, it's probably a heretical view of somebody who was at the top of an HR organization. But I also find it quite difficult when some organizations call themselves people and culture in HR. Because culture should be the accountability and management of leaders, not of HR. The minute you outsource it into HR, you've lost the game already. That's my view, and I'll say that very, very strongly. And people might disagree, and that's okay, but that's where I stand with it. Now, when you talk about HR instruments, yes, there are probably diagnostic instruments that you can use. And I think that the diagnostic instruments will probably give you a view of what's happening. But again, if you don't have your leaders who are willing to listen and be open to what those diagnostic instruments yield, you're going to be playing to a different audience. To really impact the culture, to really have a change, if you don't have it right from the top, you can use any instruments you want. Organizations will spend a lot of money on this, but it's not going to shift the dial at all. And I think that's my view on it.
I think that's right. Thank you.
Okay.
Paul, are you happy we just carry on sort of as we are at the moment? Is it okay? Yeah.
All right. So we have Ijeoma says, how can one handle a situation where the organizational culture is in theory, not in practice, especially by the core leaders? I think that's similar to
I think it's the same theme we're talking about,
yes,
and it happens in a lot of organizations I've seen. I'll give you a very quick story. A very, very big bank that shall be remain unnamed, that I did a lot of work with, who in the early 2010s was under a lot of regulatory scrutiny for fraud and other activities that they were involved with. And it's very interesting you talk about culture in theory, not in practice, because in an organization that was going through that, when you walked into their lobby in their head office, in their lobby was a big glass perspex box that said integrity. So that's about, theory versus practice and actually what's going on. I think that, as we say, all roads lead back to leaders, because if you think about it, in terms of culture, it is the management of culture is what leadership really is. And I think that's something to think about. Okay, there's another one here that says, what's your advice to a CEO who wants to acquire another company and wants to take into account the culture of the company to be acquired? I think that is very, Yop, that is very, very astute. And actually, that is something that I would say would be one of the things so I have been doing a lot of work in M&A as well. And what's really interesting is that in the due diligence phase, when you're looking at numbers and you're looking at structures and everything else, as a part of that, looking at the culture of the organization you acquire is going to be so important, especially if it's an acquisition, because what you're bringing into your own organization will either support, enhance, or even denigrate the culture of the original organization. So think about it as in cultures that we all.
Oh, I think we lost him.
Yeah,
we lost him. I'm sure he'll come straight back in again. But I think if I may pick this up as well, so many mergers fail because of a culture mismatch. And so there's a really interesting set of studies that you can go and look at, and Standish is one of them, for instance, where organizational failure was primarily down to a culture mismatch. And actually, that's the one thing that so many organizations pay so little attention to. It's not about the technical merger. It's not about the technology. It's about how you bring people on board and bring them together into a central goal, aspiration, vision, whatever the case might be. Just whilst we wait for Ajit to rejoin us, I hope that what you found today was some real practical applications around how organizations survive and thrive, and how important it is to be able to lean into organizational culture. The other thing we wanted to bring to the fore is that there are means of diagnosis of culture. And you may recall that in previous sessions, we discussed Bob Barrett as one example, and Ajit is back. Hello, Ajit. We're still just on the topic of organizations that thrive through mergers and those that don't. And I was simply talking around diagnostics for a moment. And we're saying you can actually measure culture, and you can measure what are the limiting behaviors that stand in the way of good culture. But I think Ajit had said it up front. It absolutely relies on the leader and how the leader leads that process. Ajit, back to you.
I'm sorry, I forgot what else I think we were talking about CEOs acquiring and being acquisitory, and really thinking about how important it is when you're bringing two organizations together, that the cultures actually are compatible. Otherwise, that becomes very difficult otherwise, because you're bringing two. It's like an arranged marriage, two people who are not compatible coming together. It's exactly like that.
Indeed. It's a great example. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajit. Thank you, Dr. Woods. It's been a very, very enlightening approach and enlightening talk today. And for those of us who would like to, like Dr. Woods mentioned, who would like to probably do some diagnosis in the organization or something as relates to culture, you can always reach out and we would get you the needed help. And if you need the slides, we don't send the slides to everyone after the meeting because we don't want to clog your emails with every week with the slides. So if you just need them, let me know. Just send it a chat, put it in the chat, and we'll pick it up after the session. And likewise, we have a YouTube channel where you can always go there to watch a replay. That's BSN YouTube channel. You go there every week. We upload the session, so you can always go there to watch a replay. Thank you very much, Dr. Woods. Thank you very much, Dr. Menon. It's been a very, very insightful, a very, very knowledgeable session. And we would please wait behind after the session, Dr. Ajit and Dr. Woods, just for a reflection while I just close today's session. Next week, we shall be discussing beyond the hype, how AI is reshaping business models and leadership decisions with Henry Eriga. He's the founder and CEO of Edva Business Solutions Limited. And Divine Matthew will be the reflector. He's the founder of Grace AI Lab. Beyond the hype, how AI is reshaping business models and leadership decision. However, before we wrap up, I want to say thank you for making today an excellent session. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Menon, and thank you for your reflection as well, Dr. Woods. Thank you, our lovely audience, for your participation and questions, and Team BSN and our corporate partners, the Culture Factor Group, and Chin Global, want to say thank you. So till next week, see you all again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.